Welcome to Caregiver Chats. I'm Dr. Lakelyn. Today we're diving into the second part of a 3-part series on caregiving relationships with a discussion about spousal caregiving. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Caregiver Chats is a podcast designed to help those caring for older adults find balance, support, resources, and encouragement. If you're caring for an aging family member or friend, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Dr. Lakelyn. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an honor company. I know how busy caregivers are, and I'm so grateful that you're taking time to listen. Last episode, I talked with Jenny Monroe, an adult daughter and caregiver. She cared for her mom who passed away from Alzheimer's disease and is now caring for her dad who's on hospice. If you're an adult child caring for a parent, you will want to go back and be sure to listen to that episode. Today, I'm really looking forward to the topic of spousal caregiving in our 3-part series. We know that spousal caregivers make up about 11% of all caregiving relationships. Many people in a spousal relationship or partnership have an additional layer of loyalty and obligation. They also experience changes in the relationship dynamics that can take a heavy toll on the care partner. I'm looking forward to diving deeper into this topic with Laurel Wittman, President and Board Member of Well Spouse Association, an organization that's dedicated to supporting the partners of people living with chronic illness or disability. And I want to tell you a little about Laurel because she's amazing. Laurel joined Well Spouse Association as a member in 2014 with a particular interest in reaching younger spouses like herself. And she now serves as board president and co-facilitates its Younger Well Spouse support group. Laurel and her husband, Eduardo, have been married for more than 15 years. Eddie was diagnosed with MS in 1998, and while he was in his early 20s and along his journey, Laurel has been supporting him as his care partner. And I'll let Laurel herself tell a little bit more of her story in just a bit. But I want to first stop and say, welcome, Laurel. So excited to have you.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here today.
Well, the pleasure is certainly all mine. And as I mentioned, I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your story and your caregiving journey. So would you mind kind of kicking us off by sharing?
I'd be happy to. So my story began with Eddie when we met, and he was 28, I was 22. It was a fairly typical love story, I guess, except that on our 3rd date, he told me that he had MS, and I happened to know a little bit about it. We actually were watching West Wing at that moment, and the president on that show had just been diagnosed, and Eddie used that as his opening to tell me that this was the case. And I kind of said, all right, well, that's fine. It doesn't change anything. Let's kind of keep going. And, it turned into a relationship and we ended up married. His disability did progress pretty quickly. He was working full time when we met, and he was, totally mobile. Sometimes he would get a little more tired. He might walk a little bit, like he had a couple of drinks from time to time, and that was primarily what I saw as his disease. But it did progress quickly. By the time we got married, 3 years later, when he was 31, he needed a cane or a wheelchair. And within probably 6 or 7 years, he wasn't really able to leave the bed under his own power, and he has needed 24-hour care for about the last 15 years. So it's been, quite a journey for us, a little unusual even among people with MS, and that's why I was grateful to find Well Spouse, who could provide a lot of support along the way for what has really been the toughest journey we've both been on in different ways.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that beautiful love story. And for sharing just kind of about the disease progression. I know that everyone's caregiving journey looks very different, and it kind of depends on, what the care recipient is managing in terms of their health. And so it's just kind of helpful for us to understand your journey. And then I love that you got connected to Well Spouse. So could you tell us more about what Well Spouse is and what their mission is?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So WellSpouse is a 35-year-old organization. It is the only organization that supports the partners of people living with chronic illness or disability. There are a lot of really terrific disease-oriented organizations and, general caregiving organizations, but we focus specifically on the partners because we think that they have a special role that they are playing in this journey, and they have challenges and a need for community that's a little different than the person who has the illness or disability themselves. So I always joke with people that if you have found WellSpouse after doing a middle of the night Google search because you were panicking and can't take it anymore, you found us the same way that I did. We are a small organization, but I think we have a really outsized impact in caregivers' lives. We do hear about that from the people who end up joining our community and staying around for years. We are disease agnostic. We are stage agnostic. We have some members whose partners don't have diagnoses yet. That may be because they're a little earlier in the journey, or it may be that they have something, unusual that, doesn't have a label yet. And we support people all the way through to, for what many of us may be, a terminal portion of the disease journey. And we also support people after their partners may have passed. And then a special community are people who have potentially divorced their partners. And that might be for relationship reasons, but it can also be for financial reasons, which is a particularly unusual dynamic of spousal caregiving.
Wow.
So we support everyone.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm so glad that WellSpouse exists. And I love that you really meet caregivers or care partners wherever they are on their journey and support them even after. And even just in your description of WellSpouse, there's so many topics I want to dive into. Oh my goodness. This is going to be such a great conversation. I cannot wait. But before we really kind of dig into some of the differences and challenges, in a previous episode of this podcast, I talked about how people don't always identify as a caregiver or care partner. And I'm curious, do you find this to be true for spousal caregivers or caregiving partners as well?
Yes, I think it's actually probably more true for spousal caregivers. I know it was certainly true for me because there is a real blurring of the nature of our relationship with our partner, separate from the illness and what happens during the course of an illness. You hope, I think, in most marriages that there is some kind of balance, right? It may not always be 50-50 at all times, but somebody's there to help you pick up the slack when you need it and vice versa. In many of our relationships, that balance is kind of... it shifts in ways that are maybe not as perceptible to you while they're happening. You might start with a partner who's able, in my case, might mow the lawn or go buy groceries. And then over time, all of that falls to you. And so I think it can be the caregiving role can be very insidious in that way, in a way that's a little different than other caregiving relationships. And then I think a lot of it is typical of all kinds of caregiving that you may not feel like a caregiver, but, from the outside, I think we would certainly think you are. You're a caregiver if you go to doctor's appointments and you're just there to listen or support your partner or drive them or, to be present for them in that part of the experience. You're a caregiver if you're paying all of the bills and raising the kids and taking care of all the things around the house, which is, I think that's more readily identified with other kinds of caregiving because it's more unusual. If a daughter goes and pays her mom's bills, that feels like caregiving. It's a little different, with our kinds of relationship.
Yeah, well, and another term that I've talked about on this podcast is caregiver creep, how those activities just kind of creep up on you, and before you know it, you're in this full-time caregiving role and you haven't really taken the time to acknowledge it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly my experience, as I was basically a caregiver from the start of our relationship in one way or another with Eddie, even though it wasn't apparent to me. And it wasn't apparent until I was kind of hitting rock bottom in the role, feeling very isolated, very lonely. His needs had gotten increasingly medical, increasingly complex. And it wasn't, I think, until I kind of hit that point that I was like, wait a second, now I know what's been going on here. Yeah. But it wasn't a label that I immediately associated myself with. And certainly not as, somebody in their early 30s, right?
Oh, absolutely.
It feels very different, I think, to people in my age group, which was why it was important to me and remains important to me to make sure WellSpouse is reaching, partners in that age bracket.
Yeah. Yes. I think when you think of caregivers, you think of kind of like a middle-aged woman who's
caring for an elderly parent.
Yep. Exactly. And when we look at all of kind of the statistics around caregiving, there's so much great information out there. The National Alliance for Caregiving puts out a study, and I know that they kind of dissect all that information, and Home Instead has sponsored that study over the years. I love that study.
It's terrific. Yep.
Yeah. And we know that there's about 48 million Americans that provide care, and that includes really all types of caregivers. But of that number, about 6 million are providing care to a partner or spouse due to illness or disability. And we've talked a little bit about the differences, but what are some other characteristics that we see unique to the spousal caregiving community?
Sure. So as you noted, the caregivers in in this demographic tend to be a little bit older because you tend to be age matched with your care recipient. So, obviously as people age, the likelihood of having a chronic disability or illness impact you increases as well. So they do tend to be older, but not exclusively. About half of the spousal caregiving population is under the age of 65. So that points to the fact that this does impact people. It can impact people from a very young age, as it did in my particular situation. I love this one. 19% of spousal caregivers have kids at home.
Wow.
That's not a demographic you think about a lot. Or they're people who are literally, going down this journey and this path and stepping up and taking on, in some cases, 100% of the parenting role for young kids and dealing with their emotional journey as well. So that's again, it doesn't fit that mental picture a lot of us have for spousal caregivers, but there are a lot of people out there that fit that profile. They also are more likely to be men, which makes sense if you think intuitively about how often women are the people who have a lot of the, in particular, long-standing autoimmune diseases, right? Which is kind of the case. MS is more typical for women than men. So you end up with a lot of male partners who are the spousal caregivers in that case. And then there's some demographics around financial impacts and, educational impacts, that sort of thing. I think some of those probably are responses to the caregiving role. They tend to be a little bit less financially supported, and they tend to have lower education levels. That may be because they are in this caregiving role, and that, impacts their both their financial situation and their ability to progress in their education as they might want.
Thank you for sharing more about this kind of cohort of caregivers. I wouldn't have thought about males being more common, and because again, we think of females as usually stepping into a caregiving role, and just in what I've learned about male versus female caregivers, the support that they need looks different, and the acceptance of help is different for both groups. So very important to note about this specific population. And, I also, one of the other things you mentioned that struck me is that they have young kids at home. And I talk about sandwich caregivers. And you think about, in those scenarios where it's, again, the adult daughter who has kids, but caring for mom or dad. But, oh man, the role of, being the spousal caregiver and then being 100% of the parent role, that's got to be really, really challenging.
Yeah, it is. That is definitely something we spend a lot of time in our support groups talking about.
Oh, I bet. So what I'm gathering is the role of a spousal caregiving partner is very unique. And we've talked about some of the differences so far. And one specific difference is that they're often providing more care. And can you just share with us a little bit more about why that's true? I mean, I'm getting a sense as to why it's true just based on our conversation, but would love for you to share more.
Yeah, some of it I think is the nature of the illnesses. And our members, the number one illness type that brings them, or that they come to WellSpouse with, is some kind of neurological disease. So think of diseases like Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis. I would put in that category. It's sort of neurological, sort of autoimmune, ALS. And some of these diseases last a very, very long time. Then you think of memory loss. That is, I think, the number two area that we have members that are facing that as their challenge. Again, that's a number of years of care that they're providing. They also tend to be progressive. And so, you might start with relatively minor tasks in this role, and then over time, they become, candidly quite overwhelming for one person to be providing. So the nature of care tends to pick up more of what we call the activities of daily living. So these are the ways that people can demonstrate their personal independence, and that can be both literally, can they dress themselves? Can they feed themselves? As well as some of the independent living activities, like can they pay their own bills? Can they grocery shop? The ways that they might be able to live alone. So we tend to help with more of those activities of daily living. And then our care also tends to be more medically intensive. So for instance, in my husband's case, he was just recently hospitalized with an infection. And he got through it, with the help of some terrific IV antibiotics, and they sent him home. Well, now that he's home, I'm still helping him be administered IV antibiotics 3 times a day. I am a finance person by training. I do not have nursing skills, except for what I've picked up along the way here, but I am, cleaning off the hub of his PICC line and connecting the IV antibiotic to it and making sure the tubing line has no bubbles, because that would be, potentially catastrophic, and running that antibiotic so that he gets the care he needs. And in the past, that's care that would have been performed in a hospital setting or with nurses coming in. So that's just a small piece of the care that I might be asked to perform given his condition now. We also tend to do this for a longer period of time. So, as you think about somebody caring for maybe an elderly parent, you might be, the window of that illness might be shorter. So Eddie's MS is, we're 25 years into this now, and that's not at all uncommon for these kinds of diseases. And then we have a lot of people who, we're seeing this more and more as we have better treatments for a lot of the diseases that in the past might have been fatal or terminal. They've become chronic. So we have members who, their partner had cancer and they treated it and they got better, which is great, except maybe the treatment left them with some kind of impact that's now going to be permanent. So they don't have cancer anymore. That's good news, but it doesn't mean their life has gone back to anything that looked like it did, prior to the diagnosis. And that can go on for years and years, when you're in your 30s and you're looking out, again, for decades of potential caregiving. It's scary. It's terrifying.
Wow. Gosh, that is important to consider, is just the longevity of this caregiving role. And, when you look again back at the statistics, spousal caregivers tend to provide care for longer periods of time. And based on what you just shared, that makes a lot of sense. But I'm sure that there are challenges that come along with that, because, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You have to make sure that you're taking care of yourself along the way so you can continue to show up and be there for your spouse or your partner. So any other challenges, in terms of just the longevity of the caregiving role that is important to note?
Yeah, I think one thing, I can speak to, again, somewhat personally, is how the role changes over time. It's not a static role, especially with a progressive disease. You definitely go through different periods of the caregiving journey, and your needs change. I think that's one of the ways that Well Spoused, in fact, can be so helpful. In particular, our support groups, where you build little mini communities around you. And the meetings, take place over years and years and years. So they're really with you for different points of that journey. When I think back to when I was first learning about MS and Eddie's needs were starting to increase, I was very much, and I think this is pretty typical, I was in this research mode. I was going to fix it. We were different somehow than all of the other people with MS who have come before us. And there was a fix out there we just hadn't found. There was some drug we hadn't tried. And that's avoidance behavior, right? It's kind of not sitting with that grief that you might otherwise be feeling. And that's one phase of the journey. And then you kind of move into this acceptance phase, but I don't think it's always a good acceptance. That might be kind of the rock bottom part. I don't have a name for it exactly, but that was the point at which I started reaching out and saying, I can't do this alone anymore. There aren't any fixes. There is no white knight coming to save us from this. And in fact, it's getting worse. So, how do I kind of settle in and make this work for the duration? And then now, I've accepted our marriage is going to look very different than I thought it would, and the roles we both have and the support I get from him will have to look different. Doesn't mean I like it, but there is more of that real acceptance. But every so often something comes up and it kind of shocks you out of that again. Like, oh boy, here's a new thing I have to learn. Here's, some new emotion that's coming up as part of that journey. So, that's one thing I think about when I think about the length of that journey is it's not a static emotional response you're having along the way. You have a lot of different emotions at different points in time.
Gosh, I can only imagine. And I know we planned to talk more about those emotions in just a bit. But earlier you had mentioned, so we talked about, it's a long journey for many. And do you come across care partners or spouses that feel like they really don't have a choice and they kind of feel stuck in this role? Because I would think, you marry someone or you commit to them and you take those vows of for better or for worse. And then you find yourself in a really challenging situation. And you mentioned kind of the emotional journey and kind of the grief and the acceptance. And so maybe you could just talk a little bit about that. And if you see kind of that, the caregivers often feeling like they don't have a choice but to do this role.
Yeah, that's very common. And it's probably somewhat specific again to the nature of our role. You're right. That's the first thing people will say when they come in, usually feeling, some amount of guilt or shame about how they're feeling towards their partner. And, I said for better, for worse, and yet I don't want to do this anymore. And that's a real tough challenge. I think everyone wants out of this situation at some point. They want to be able to kind of walk out the door and leave it behind. And yet, of course, we don't want to impact our partner. And, we know the costs of doing that. And so I think most of us do stay. That support, that we can build through the kind of relationships that WellSpouse can offer, I think helps people in that role and helps them find themselves a little more. It's real easy to kind of lose track of who you are when your partner's needs become all consuming and you don't feel like you have a choice in that, in moving forward with them. And some people don't move forward, right? That's the other piece. WellSpouse tends to see the people who are sticking out the caregiver relationship, if you will. But there are a lot of people who don't. And, that's complicated. And, it's hard to stand in judgment, given how difficult this all is. But I'm grateful we do have these resources to make it work for the people who make that choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'd love to talk more about kind of the community and how kind of isolating this role can be and how important finding that community is. But first, we're going to just take a short commercial break and then we'll dive back into the topic. This podcast is brought to you by Home Instead, an honor company. If you find yourself needing extra support as a family caregiver or time away from your caregiving responsibilities, Home Instead can help. Our home care services are delivered by compassionate care professionals and range from personal care, meal preparation, and medication management to Alzheimer's care and hospice support. Visit homeinstead.com to learn more and to find a location near you. So, Laura, we were just talking about, how it's so important for spousal caregivers to plug into a community because caregiving can be so isolating. And we hear that across the board from, all types of caregivers, but specific to spousal caregivers, is there anything in particular that makes this type of caregiving more isolating than other types of caregiving, would you say?
Yeah, there are a couple reasons, I think. One is that spousal caregivers tend to be sole caregivers more often than other caregiving types. So something like 2/3 of spousal caregivers do all of the caregiving themselves, which is just an enormous physical burden. It's an enormous financial burden. You're more likely to bring somebody in from the outside if you are not having if it's not a spousal caregiving relationship. Some of that is probably that role shifting that we talked about earlier, that, it feels like this is what you signed up for and that this is just what you do because you were married to the person, separate from, whatever caregiving and the illness might be. Sometimes it's a sense of pride and privacy for the person who has the illness. So they may not want somebody to come in, which, as the care partner is hard to hear because I think they don't always appreciate the patient, if you will, does not always appreciate how isolating this is. It's not just their journey. it's also our journey. And, that can be a really difficult thing to deal with that does come up sometimes for people in our community that, their partner doesn't want them to talk about the experience or to get help or to bring in other people. And that's really hard and contributes to that feeling of isolation. We also, as spousal caregivers, we are less likely to qualify for programs that might be applicable to people in other kinds of caregiving relationships. Because, we're married to them. That, I think, some of the government programs and probably commercial programs as well assume that, because we have generally signed up for financial responsibility by virtue of getting married to the person, that this is kind of our problem to solve. So there are programs where, for instance, caregivers that are children of people with illness might be eligible to get paid for the caregiving services they provide, but a spouse can't. And at the same time, the spouse is less likely to be working because it's very expensive to provide care. Somebody has to do it, and they can't afford to have a third party do it. So it can be a very difficult situation. And then a lot of services are available for people that are older. Different associations and government programs are targeted towards people who are in older age brackets. And so there isn't always a lot of help for that, subset of people, the 50% of people who are under age 65. They might not qualify for a lot of that programming. So it can be very, very difficult.
Yeah, those are some really, I think, important call outs, just the challenges that spousal caregivers are facing and when it comes to supports and finances. And I'd like to just double click on kind of the finances quick, because you've brought it up a couple times already, that spousal caregiving can take a toll on finances. So can you just share a little bit more about that and how that impacts the caregiving dynamic and also just the caregiving journey? Yeah.
So at the most basic level, in a spousal caregiving relationship, you often end up with the person who has the illness or disability not being able to work, and the other person, the partner, the care partner, also having to leave the workforce because their job or their career does not provide sufficient flexibility for somebody who might need hours and hours of caregiving each day. Yeah. When you think about the cost of 24-hour care in, a lot of metro areas, which can be north of $100,000 a year and well north of $100,000 a year, and you think of the average salary that most people make, the math just does not work out. And the piece that a lot of people forget too on that is that illness is expensive. A lot of things are not covered by insurance, and you have a lot of specialized needs that other families don't have. And so you have the double impact of both the loss of income from one or both people, as well as the increased expenses due to illness and the resources you need.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for sharing those additional insights and the impacts that it can have on a person's finances. I know we see, throughout the various types of caregiving, sometimes people having to maybe step back from their employment situation or make modifications. But you really kind of gave some good insights into why a person might need to stop working to care full time if they're a spousal caregiver or caring for a partner. So thank you for sharing that. And I know we've also, one of the other things we've been talking about is kind of that emotional roller coaster. I think you've painted a picture of kind of all of the various emotions that go into caregiving. But I know sometimes we like to focus on like the challenges and the negatives. What are some of the positives emotions associated with the caregiving role? Because I hope it's not, all kind of wah-wah, doom and gloom. I hope that there's some positive aspects of it.
Yeah, this is the tying things up with a bow, as one of my well-spouse friends refers to it, which is such a strong temptation, I think. So it is very difficult, but I would say there are positive benefits. I think for me, it's made me a very different person than I was. Things that used to feel very important and overwhelming, I have a very different view on when things in our house are literally life and death, as they often are. So that's one thing that I'm interested in seeing how it kind of plays out over the rest of my life, to see how taking this journey has change that kind of fundamental part of me. I've learned acceptance and meeting people where they are. There's a lot about illness and disability that people can't give you what you want, and so you have to go to where they are. And that, I think, is a very positive thing. I've also, I think, learned how to sit with people in grief. I think, as a nation and probably as a world, we are not very good at that.
No.
We like to fix things. We like people to feel better. We like to we like to be there for the good parts, and it's very hard to be there for the bad parts. I think people are afraid of saying the wrong thing or causing more damage, or they don't know what to do and they do nothing. And that's tough, So I think, I hope that my friends and family and people around me would say that I have an increased ability to sit with people going through very difficult things and be there with them and for them, and not and give them what they need instead of what I am able to give them. So I think those are a few positives that people can find along the way, even among some really difficult times. And there are moments of real joy, even when my husband's in the hospital. It resets this kind of journey resets your expectations so that the bright spots shine more brightly than they might otherwise. My husband, all he can move independently at this point is his head and neck. The rest of his body cannot move, but we still have dance parties. We will put on, the Pandora stations he likes, and he'll sing the songs to me, and, I'll come in and I'll see him moving his head around, and that brings me such joy in that minute. There was probably a time, 6, 8, 10 years ago where that would have caused intense sadness because I would have seen all he lost. And instead, in those moments now, I can see what he still has. And that's really beautiful.
That is really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I don't mean to pry into people's personal lives, but I know that I know that when you're caring for a spouse, it does change. We talked about the relationship dynamics and an added layer to that, and this is something we get asked a lot, and I think it's because people don't want to talk about it, is the intimacy between a spousal caregiver and the person they're caring for. And so you can talk in generalities, you can talk however you'd like about it, but I would just love your thoughts and perspectives in the interactions you've had with fellow spousal caregivers. How does this play out, and how does it impact the journey?
Right. So this topic, I'm so glad you're bringing it up, because this, at the end of the day, I think is really the one people are most afraid to talk about, even in our community. And it really is the one that sets apart spousal or this kind of caregiving from other kinds of caregiving, Absolutely. Right? Most people marry or are partnered with the intention of having an intimate relationship, and usually one of them. And, illness and disability has a way of throwing a real wrench into the nature of that relationship. And it can be more complicated than, what you might initially think of, which is the person with the illness, has a physical or emotional or, whatever reason that they aren't able to participate in that kind of relationship. It could be the partner that has those challenges. It could be that the partner's disease causes a loss of cognitive ability, for instance, so that your partner may become what feels very childlike to you. And that's very distressing to try and build and create or maintain an intimate relationship with a person who seems childlike and seems like, frankly, a different person than the person you married. We also see in some of these diseases that there can be behavioral changes. For instance, in Parkinson's disease, we're aware that can, in some cases, cause hypersexuality with the person who has the illness. And that can, combined with behavioral changes, can be tremendously off-putting to the partner, that they don't feel that the person they're in this relationship with wants them for them. It's, a function of their disease, and it's distressing. So the intimate relationship and the loss of that, and it doesn't happen to everyone, which is terrific news, but it does happen to an awful lot of people, and there is tremendous shame in talking about it. And frankly, there aren't a lot of great answers. I remember early on, the Eddie's particular disease organization had put together a pamphlet on preserving an intimate relationship. And, I found it recently now going through some papers, not too long ago, and none of it would apply to us now. This is the guy who can't move anything but his head. There isn't a room, there isn't room for, gentle touches or, whatever other ideas sounded good, to put in this pamphlet. So it's an area that, in some ways the best we can do is just to continue to talk about it, and hopefully people will understand they are not alone and that their needs matter. I think it can be, people feel a lot of guilt and shame around having physical needs in the midst of all of this illness, and they're human needs. That need for connection is a human one, and it doesn't go away. In fact, in a lot of ways, it probably only increases when you're going through the kind of stress and trauma that this kind of caregiving role can create.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing and for being vulnerable and for indulging me in this in somewhat taboo topic. But
yeah,
to your point,
it's an important one.
Yeah, it's so important. And, we all have that desire to be loved and cared for and nurtured. And when you're providing most of the care and not getting that back, that's really, really hard. And so I know that, for some folks, intimacy changes. For some, it might be temporarily put on hold or permanently put on hold. But I'm glad that we're creating a little bit of space to talk about it. We could probably talk a whole hour just on that topic.
Yep.
And maybe we will someday. I'll have you back on.
I hope so. That's great.
But you've talked about, the term guilt, the emotion of guilt quite a bit. And I often hear caregivers say, I feel bad that I'm not doing enough, or I'm not enough for the other people in my life that aren't the care recipient. There's so many ways that guilt can show up. And so
feel you're failing people all around you. Yes.
Yeah. So how would you maybe, or do you have any tips for caregivers on, how they can manage that guilt, or ways that you can kind of cope with that along the journey?
Yeah. So one, and I think this is a really important one, is to not compound it by feeling guilty. You're feeling guilty.
Yeah.
You need to know that this is a really, really human emotion, really human to feel, and what we are doing is not it can't be the work of one person. You're not going to meet the moment at 100% of the time for years and years and years and years. You will fail your partner in some small way, maybe in some large way. You will fail the other people in your life, the family and friends around you. The guilt is hard to avoid, and it's hard to talk people out of. Except, there is a real role, I think, in telling them it's normal. That's often something we hear when people first come into our support groups or, to one of our events, that they are feeling this guilt, and is that okay? And man, do I jump in there fast. Like, yes, that is totally okay, totally normal. You are not alone in feeling, that guilt and shame are such a pervasive part of this experience. This is more than one person could ever do for many of us, and so we are all doing the best we can, and we will do it imperfectly because we're human, and that's what humans do. So I think just knowing that it is a normal part of the experience. And I think that also then helps with the feeling that you can only take time away or continue doing the things you're doing without guilt. I think that can be a waste of time. Don't try and eliminate the guilt. Just know that it's going to be there, and just keep going. It's never, I think it's kind of a fool's errand to try and eliminate that emotion when that's all it is. It's an emotion. Move past it and do what you're going to do anyway.
Well, thank you for sharing some thoughts on that. None of us are perfect, and we all fall short in various ways at various times. And so I think that it's great that you encourage caregivers, in a way, almost like accept that there's going to be guilt.
Normalize it. Yeah.
And normalize it. Absolutely. Well, and just coming from the world of home care, I also see a lot of guilt. And you made mention of this earlier. caregivers feel guilty bringing in outside help and support. So do you see that within the Well Spouse community amongst your fellow spousal caregivers, and any advice on how to navigate maybe that guilt or resistance that they might face?
Yeah. So, this is one we do talk about a lot again in our support groups, that kind of the logistical points of when is the right time to bring in somebody. And what I always say is that if you're asking if you need to bring in somebody, you probably should. You're at that point. You're probably a little beyond that point where you need additional help. And yeah, you can feel again like you're not meeting the moment. You ought to be able to do all of this, but we all need breaks, and having care at home, can give you that break. And you might still be around the house, and your partner might still want you doing the work, but it can just provide that sense that you're not quite so isolated. I couldn't live the life I do without the care that I have in my home, and it doesn't mean it's easy. I'm tremendously fortunate to have a really trusted caregiver. She's been with us for years now. She works, many hours a week with us, and it allows me to run errands. It allows me to work. It allows me to take breaks. It's even allowed me to travel from time to time, and I know that's unique. I don't say any of that to brag. I guess I make that point just because I probably have kind of the ideal setup here, and it's still the hardest thing I've ever done. And she's an incredibly important part of my team too, not just my partner's team. That's something too that we hear a lot, is the partner doesn't want to bring somebody in. And, we talk about different strategies for, talking to your partner about how the aide or the care worker that you might bring in from the outside isn't just for them. It's really for you too. I need a break.
Yes.
This is a person that can help me. This isn't a person who's coming here to help you. And that can help kind of bridge that tough time when you might first be introducing a paid or unpaid caregiver to your marital relationship.
Yeah. Yes. Well, of course, and having somebody into your home, into that care environment is very personal. And so that's another reason that I think we see a lot of times resistance or hesitance is, oh gosh, I don't know if I want a stranger in my home. But as you alluded to, they quickly become part of the care team, part of the family, and can become so helpful. So I think that tip you gave of sharing, this isn't just for you, it's also for me as your care partner, can hopefully help maybe open their mind to the benefits that it can have.
Right.
Well, and we've been talking about all the complexities that come along with, spousal caregiving. And, on social media, you can list your relationship status as complicated. I remember when that first came out, I thought it was hilarious. But it can be true for spousal caregivers. And we've touched on it a little bit, but any other thoughts on this? And I think one thing you touched on earlier that was super interesting, and maybe you could just expand briefly on, is divorce and maybe caring for an ex-spouse. We see that a lot. From time to time in home care, is they're calling for care for their ex-spouse to kind of help out the children or whatnot. So anyway, I would love for you to maybe share a little more about that, because I'm very intrigued.
Yeah, so I would look at that in kind of two different ways. One is that, these are marriages first, right? And not all marriages last. And so there are, a lot of people, the caregiving piece on top of the, what might be a troubled relationship or marriage will lead to, kind of a typical divorce. We're better off not as partners. I talked about this earlier, that for a number of partners, we see financial divorces though, which is a way of, there is still love there, and there is still a desire to be that person's primary intimate, partner, or have that primary intimate relationship. But for financial reasons, it's better for them not to be together. It gives the person with the illness more access to resources and services that they can't have if they stay married. That seems to be, it's not entirely uniquely American, but it is kind of a function of, unfortunately, of, some of the lack of resources, I guess, for people in this situation here, that path becomes a reasonable one. And, the people who have to choose that route generally are heartbroken to have to go down that road. They do not want to be getting that divorce. And so if they're reaching out to you for care, they're probably doing it because they still very much have, or to bring in caregivers, they still have, that committed caring relationship that they want to provide for this person. And then, there are people though too who care for exes that they don't like anymore too. So, these relationships really can take all forms. That's why we do feel it's an important, subset of our membership that, you are not cast out from the well spouse community just because you are no longer a spouse who wants to have that kind of committed caring relationship. We know there are, the caregiving relationship and illness complicates things, as you said. And, there's room for all kinds of relationships with your primary partner here in our community.
Well, thank you for sharing more about that. I really, to be honest, hadn't really thought about the kind of financial reasons for divorce. And so that just really opens my eyes to it. And I look forward to learning more about that. So thank you for sharing. And I know Well Spouse, you've referenced it so much throughout our time together today. It seems like such a fabulous resource. And how have you, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience with Well Spouse? What, if somebody wanted to engage, what kind of things could they expect? I know you have a great website, so maybe share that first and we'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is wellspouse.org. So keep it easy. And the things you can expect from joining us are peer support, events, and resources to make caregiving less complicated and easier for you. The peer support piece is important, so I'll touch on that briefly. We are not an organization that, hires professional facilitators to lead our support groups. We do bring in experts for events, but we are all either current or former caregivers, and so spousal caregivers, and so we have been in everyone's shoes. The diseases might be different, the path might be different, our ages might be different, but underneath it all, there's the common experience and emotional journey that many of us are on. So that is, why I want to just touch on what we provide. If you are in an immediate crisis, or in need of care from professionals, we shouldn't be your first stop. That's, we are volunteering our time almost exclusively to be a community that well spouses can get support from. The way I found it, and the way a lot of people find it, is we have more than 30 different support group meetings each month. And before COVID, they were almost all in person around the country, around the U.S. And now many of them are on Zoom, and many of them have gone back to being in person. So you can find both, you can find groups that meet your geographic needs if you want, a local community around you, which was really important to me. But you can also find people across the country who are going through similar things. And almost all of our groups are all ages, all diseases, all comers. But we do have 2 groups specifically for former well spouses. So those are people whose partners have either passed or they have divorced their partners, as we talked about, or separated from them, living separately. And then we have 2 groups that are specific for our younger well spouses. And those are generally people in their 20s to 50s who, have some unusual needs from the broader well spouse community. We might still be raising kids. We are still in the workforce. We haven't had the opportunity maybe to have the financial resources build up over time because, we were diagnosed in our 20s. So those needs can be a little different. But anyone can join any of these meetings if they feel they are useful. And then we do, interesting events that are topical to well spouses. So for instance, earlier this year, we had a movie discussion on Lady Chatterley's Lover, which is, it was a new Netflix adaptation of a classic novel. And, it had many caregiving themes and discussion about intimacy within a relationship with somebody who's disabled. And we all got together to talk about it and, shed some light on, or approach, I guess, a current event or current, something in the movies in a little different way with a little different audience. We're about to do a book discussion this weekend. We've done a couple of our respites that we do each year. And then this fall, we will have our annual conference, and it will be online this year. We have a terrific speaker lineup so far. So I'm very excited about putting that together.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing more about Well Spouse, and I hope everyone will go check out the website, wellspouse.org. Laurel, I want to thank you for joining me. Before I let you go, if people were to remember one piece of advice or one tidbit from today's discussion, what would you want them to remember?
Yeah, I want to go right to that feeling of isolation and tell people that they aren't alone. They may feel alone. They may feel especially alone in the middle of the night when things are going wrong and your husband or wife is not feeling well, or, and you can't reach any of the resources you need and you can't call people you want to call, in those dark hours of the morning. If you need to Google, come find Well Spouse, or find another community. If the fit isn't right, find people who can be around you and support you through this difficult journey so that you don't feel that sense of being alone.
What a great piece of advice to end today's discussion on. And Laurel, thanks for all you do to come alongside other spousal caregivers and care partners. I know that the work and the just advocacy and energy you put into this is so important. And I just, again, want to say thank you. I want to thank Laurel for sharing her story and insights. I know so many of you listening can likely relate and have your own story about caring for a spouse or partner. I would encourage you to email me with your thoughts, stories, and advice for spousal caregivers. My email address is caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. That's caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. I hope you will join me for the next episode, which is the third podcast in our 3-part series about caregiving relationships. In this episode, I'm going to chat with fellow gerontologist and caregiver April Ibarra about caring for non-immediate relatives. That would be people like an aunt, cousin, neighbor, or friend. I really hope you'll tune in. I also invite you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Home Instead Inc. Again, that's Home Instead INC. There you'll find previews of upcoming episodes, caregiving tips, and more. And all of these links are in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and please remember to take good care of yourself while you're caring for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, please visit homeinstead.com/caregiverchats to learn more.